Well, good morning. Thank you very much, Matthew. Thank you, Reid, and great to be here again at the Australian Brahman Breeders Association Conference. Great to be here in Katherine. I always enjoy coming to the Territory. I unfortunately missed the NTCA this year, so it's nice to get my Territory fix here at the Brahman Conference. I'm going to have to speak pretty quickly because I've been given half an hour to cover global economic stuff, and I've taken a bit of poetic license. I've thrown in some global cattle market updates and Australian cattle market updates, and hopefully I'm not treading on too many toes for those later in the agenda. But I've got to try and cover that all in about half an hour, so I'm going to have to speak pretty quickly. You probably saw on the agenda economic outlook as the item for this morning. Gladly, it is the first item up, so everyone's fully awake. We've all had about 3 hours sleep since last night, so we're ready to go. But it is a little bit of a dull subject, so I've tried to weave a theme through it. So I've got us going on a bit of a road trip. I know there are a couple of people on a bus here doing a bit of a road trip, so I've tried to extend that theme through here. It's probably not very funny, but it's at least trying to tie it all together. So as I said, we're going to have to walk through pretty quickly, but no land speed records. I am walking on thin ice at the moment. I had the wonderful opportunity of driving my family down to Thredbo. I'm based in Sydney. For the long weekend, of course, it's double demerits. My wife was in my ear the whole way down about not speeding because it's double demerits and you don't want to lose any points. We got home to receive 2 letters in the mail. And you know what they are because there's a specific address where the New South Wales police fines come from. And she's opened it and discovered that she's been caught twice within 1.5 hours on the road trip back for not wearing a seatbelt correctly. I was the driver. She quite happily hands it to me and says, "You were the driver, you're responsible." Double the merits, that's 12 points. So she wrote me a little text yesterday and said, "I've paid your fine." It's like, great. So my next letter in the mail is, "You have got no points left." So I'm not speeding, but I will be driving very fast. Right, clicker. To get through this. Whoop. So the first slide that comes up is just a quick intro. Those that don't know, from a Rabobank point of view, I'm not actually a banker, but I'm part of the Rabo research team. We've got a team of global analysts in the major producing, consuming regions around the world. I draw on their information as to what's going on in their market to understand the implications from an Australian point of view and also some of the trends that we're seeing in those markets. I'll be leaning on their information, plus we also have a global economics and markets team that put together all the big sort of picture numbers around what's going on in global markets. So that's where I sit. If you're interested in talking to Rabobank about any banking things, I'm sure you all know Barry at the back of the room. I have to put this up, our legal team require it, but I'm sure you're all smart to realise that nothing I say here is specific advice, it's all just general information. Right, so the last time I spoke at the Brahman Breeders was a couple of years ago, and we were talking about high cost environments and inflation rates going through the roof, or actually they were just starting to come down. We were looking at interest rates starting to go up and seeing some of the fastest rises we'd seen in a long time with interest rates. We've sort of worked through that now, and it's looking like the highway's a little bit straighter, a little bit more of a straight and narrow. We can see off into the distance there and things are looking okay. But unfortunately, we've got a few roadworks along the way. There's a bloke with a stop sign that's going to make it a little bit rough. It's not going to necessarily be that straight highway that we thought it might have been a couple of years ago or a year and a half ago. There are going to be a few delays. We're possibly going to be stuck with traffic lights and roadworks. There might be a few potholes, quite possibly a number of speed humps along the way. But let's start on the economic stuff. So we've come off that high that we had at the inflation rates at a couple of years ago. Costs in the system have started to come down, although unfortunately they haven't come back to the same levels that they were prior to 2021, 2022. But they have started to come back down, and that's giving central banks around the world a lot more comfort. So those inflation rates now generally trending around that 2 to 3% mark for most of the major economies in the world. That's the target for a lot of these central banks in terms of where they want that inflation rate to sit. So they're feeling a lot more comfortable. You can see our projections out there for a couple of them off to the right. From an Australian point of view, we don't think there's going to be too much rise in inflation here, but the green line there is showing the US market, and I'll touch on the US as we go through that, partly due to the bloke with the stop-go sign, meaning that we think there's going to be a degree of inflation in that US market, which is going to flow through to how that Federal Reserve responds to this, and therefore what that means for that US consumer. But generally, inflation rates are much more under control. Reserve banks or central banks are feeling a lot more comfortable. We've started to see interest rates come down. And yes, Matthew, our current projection from our Ben Picton, our economist in our team, is that we're expecting at least one more rate cut for Australia, possibly around August, of about 25 basis points. There is a mounting argument for possibly a further rate cut through the course of this year or early next year. So that inflation rate, it's back in the 2 to 3% band. People are generally comfortable that we're starting to see this come down. Central banks are walking that sort of fine balance between knowing that inflation's under control, but bringing those interest rates down to allow that economy to keep sort of chugging along. Australia's a little bit different in the sense of that global market and where we sit. There are a few things going on here, and also our exposure to economic trade that mean our strength of our economy is really actually quite good. And as a result, we've seen the RBA hasn't dropped rates as quickly or as much as we've seen in some of the other economies around the world. We've seen Europe, you can see there, it dropped quite dramatically. No one fall asleep now that it's gone dark. Europe's dropped quite dramatically. The US has had a couple of big rate cuts, but there's probably a little bit of a question mark around what the US Fed Reserve is going to do now, given some of the implications of things like tariff policy, etc. But interest rates are slowly coming down. That's going to help the costs in the economy. What does this mean for overall economic growth, though? And again, it's a little bit of a mixed bag here, but a couple of years ago, we were looking at sort of economic growth slowly improving. It's changed a bit now. These are our forecasts from our Global Economics and Markets team. I've put them up there for the various countries. I've also pulled the IMF numbers for some of those other regions that we don't cover, but are important from a Northern Australian point of view for cattle trade, live cattle trade, or also box trade. You can see there, and in particular the US, economic growth in the US is going to contract. We reckon at the moment there's more than a 50% chance that the US is going to have a recession or go into a recession this year. And a recession in our technical terms is basically 2 quarters of negative growth. They've got a slightly different definition in the US, but we're expecting economic growth in the US to decline. I think it's dropping by 0.2% or something next year is our forecast. You can even see there markets like China, Brazil, also experiencing a bit of a contraction in economic growth. What we're going to talk about in a couple of slides' time in terms of the US and where it's sitting and what Trump is doing in the US and how that rolls out to the rest of the world is starting to show up. Or our Global Economics and Markets team are expecting it to have some negative implications for the global economy. Australia is a bit of a different one. We've got a bit of a growth there, as I said before. The Australian economy is ticking along okay at the moment and being heavily export orientated. A lot of our GDP growth comes out of our export values and volumes that we do. As long as that Chinese market, and you saw it back in early April when the whole tariff thing started to escalate, you saw the Australian dollar depreciate quite dramatically because there was concern around what it might mean for the Chinese economy. Things are starting to look a little bit better in terms of the China-US relationship, so that's sort of picking up our expectations in terms of Australia's growth in terms of leaning into that global market situation. So Australia's a little bit of an odd one out there, but in terms of key markets around the world and where we send stuff to, we're actually looking at a bit of a contraction in terms of economic activity. Now, what does that mean for the cattle market and for beef consumption around the world? Rough calculations that I've done show that global economic growth doesn't necessarily provide a great indicator for per capita consumption of beef. We can have economies contracting, but we can have consumers continuing to eat more. One of the biggest things that drives per capita consumption of beef is income, household income. If the consumer's got enough money in the pocket, they will go and buy beef, it seems. It's got a stronger relationship to purchasing habits than, say, the price of alternatives or the price of beef. As long as that consumer feels comfortable that they've got enough to be able to spend. So we don't have, unfortunately, a nice way of putting together household disposable income levels or wage rates around the world on a nice graph that allows us, or chart that allows us to compare all the different countries. But as a bit of a proxy, I've put up unemployment rates here, because unemployment rates give you an idea of how tight the labour market is. If unemployment is low, the labour market is tight. A lot of people are employed. Employers out there have to compete with a much smaller pool of people to be able to grow their labour force. As such, we generally have upward pressure on wages. If unemployment rates start to rise, it means that companies and businesses are starting to lay off people. They're definitely not willing to pay them anymore. There are more people out there. They don't have to compete for a more limited labour supply, and as a result, we generally see wages tend to stagnate or possibly even decline in some situations. So I'm using it here as a bit of a proxy on where possible labour or possible wages or income might go over the next couple of months. Over the next year or so. So you can see there for, I think it's Australia, Europe, my eyes are so bad I can't read that. Australia, US and the UK, all of them have a slight increase in their trend on unemployment. The US in particular, which is the orange line, sees a big jump up next year in terms of their unemployment rates. So that's potentially going to have an impact on the overall wages and incomes in those economies, and it possibly has an implication for consumption overall and consumption of meat. What does that mean from a consumer point of view? We are starting to see consumer confidence numbers tick down. And again, the US is here as a yellow line, I think. It's a bit hard to see, but in the middle there, it's come right off quite dramatically since the end of last year. That US consumer is becoming a lot more concerned about the state of the economy, about their potential employment prospects, about their income levels. Those sorts of things are starting to shape the decisions that are being made by those consumers out there in the world at the moment. So, on our road trip, we've got to stop and have a bit of sustenance as we go. I always love a good hot box. Got a bit of a series of photos as I travel around the country. Can't beat a cheese sausage. I don't know if they have them in the Northern Territory. They have them in WA. If you've been to WA, it's nothing like a good cheese sausage, where the cheese is molten temperature and you drop it on, on your pants and then create this horrible vacuum inside a car with the air conditioning on with a cheese sausage for the next couple of hours. So what's going on in food markets around the world? Generally, similarly to what we're seeing in the overall economy, food prices, and this is the FAO food price index broken into the different commodities. So you've got your cereals, your dairy, your animal protein out there. Generally, they're sort of following that same sort of trend of being relatively flat to lifting slightly. Dairy's done a bit of a crazy jump through the roof, and anyone that's been trying to buy butter lately would understand and appreciate how much the cost of butter's gone up. There's been some contractions in dairy herds that have meant that there's a bit of a supply shortage from a dairy production point of view globally. That's caused those prices to rise a lot faster than others. But as a general comment in terms of food prices around the world, they've been relatively stable. We haven't seen any of the huge jumps that we saw back in 21, 22 to put pressure on that consumer. So from a food price point of view, it's sort of ticking along reasonably well. Trying to get an understanding or a gauge on activity, purchasing activity in the consumer space, we can look at food service trade figures and retail trade figures. Now, if you listen to the Woolworths or the Coles investor calls at all, you would hear them talking about the economic pressures on the consumer facing an increasing cost of living. We're starting to see shifting habits shifting purchasing habits. There is an increase or a lean towards retail, generally. We generally see that in these situations where economies are slowing down, people are becoming more conscious about what they have available to spend on things. They will tend to eat at home more often. But in Australia, we've actually seen food service sales trending along quite well. And we've seen retail sales, as you'd expect, have trended along quite well as well. We haven't seen them dip at all. These numbers that I've got on the chart up here are the US numbers produced by the National Restaurant Association, showing restaurant sales and table turn, same store sales and customer traffic. We just dip off the edge of the side there, but you can see it on the screens. It was looking like it was improving through the course of last year. So people were feeling a little bit more confident in going out and consuming at restaurants. We then saw it take a bit of a hit at the beginning of this year. So this is all starting to line up again. Remember the numbers we had up there before around consumer confidence in the market. It started to dip at the end of last year and in the beginning of this year. We're starting to see restaurant sales in the US have come off a little bit. I had a chat with Lance, my colleague over in the US, and said, wait a minute, is this actually a change in direction here? What's going on in the US? You're telling me in the US that retail sales are good, demand for beef is great. Why are we seeing this sudden drop in restaurant sales over there? And he said, well, don't read too much into Q1 numbers. Q1 for the US is obviously winter. He said, look, Q1 numbers could be influenced by the fact that it was a cold winter and people just decided not to go out. Wait until you get the Q2, Q3 numbers, which moves into their spring and summer. You'll have a much better idea of the consumer activity and their willingness to go out by then. But there are hints there that some of this activity, consumer activity, is just shifting a little bit. You can read into that a little bit further too. These are the two big burger chains in the US, Burger King and McDonald's. Both of them, their Q1 results came out a couple of weeks ago, and looking at their comparable sales, their same store sales, both of them reported in the US experiencing contractions in their same store sales for the US for Q1 this year. Now that got me a little bit worried because generally the lower priced quick service restaurants, burgers in the US are pretty resilient to economic movements in the US. The US consumer loves burgers. They will continue to buy it, and these provide a nice cheap option for them. And when they start seeing their comparable sales decline, it does start to raise a few questions in my mind as to the strength of that US consumer at the moment. Because we'll show it in a minute, the US consumer has been driving global beef markets, and if it starts to go a little bit weaker, it might mean that we start to see a little bit of a decline in prices. But one to keep an eye on, as I said, Lance suggests that Q1 sales we probably just need to take with a grain of salt. It could have a number of factors influencing these sales numbers, but we will keep a track on that because obviously they're big buyers of Australian beef going to that US burger trade market. So we're still travelling down this highway. We come up behind a nice big cattle truck. There are a few of those moving at the moment up here, and a few of those moving all the way across the country as well. But just quickly turning to freight and logistics. With so much of our product, 75% from a beef point of view, I didn't add the live cattle into that, with so much of our product going overseas, the availability and cost of freight and logistics is very important to the Australian market. Oil prices have been tracking along nice and steady, and we're expecting them to come down a little bit further from where they are at the moment. Our global economics markets team are looking at an increase in supply in global oil supplies, and as a result, expecting those prices to trend down a little bit further. From a container point of view, we've seen a little bit of a bounce. The blue line on the graph on the right-hand side there is the dry bulk container index that we track to get an idea of what it costs to access or to use containers. The orange line are the reefer, the refrigerated container index. It doesn't move as much because the contracts are a lot longer than the dry bulk stuff, but you can see there the orange line has come down, but it's sort of plateaued. And there's a question mark around whether or not it goes up or not. I've spoken to a couple of people in the industry that have suggested it's becoming a little bit harder to get access to refrigerated containers in Australia. Now, our global freight team say, well, we can't see that in the global numbers. There was an issue back in COVID when we saw that they redistributed freight around the world, and we ended up with shortages of containers in one spot and large volumes in another. The production of containers sort of slowed right down for a while, but globally, containers and refrigerated containers seem to be okay. But we're hearing noises in the supply chain that it's becoming a little bit more difficult than it was before. Shipping companies are becoming a little bit more reluctant to take refrigerated containers. Happy to take the dry bulk ones because they're much easier to deal with. You don't have to plug them in. But that's just something to keep an eye on because it adds costs to the system. It also challenges those exporters around how they move the product through the system. But overall message, things aren't too bad from a freight and logistics point of view. Just a few things to keep an eye on. So, as I mentioned at the start, there is a guy with a stop-go sign that is potentially going to make this highway that was looking reasonably straightforward and clear. It's going to be potentially a little bit rougher. We're going to see a few speed humps, a few corrugations, a few potholes and a few stops and goes. So, what's going on with Trump and the US and where we might see some of the implications of this going? Our global economics and markets team, and there's one particular global strategist in particular that does a wonderful job in explaining some of his theories around the ambitions or the end goals from a US point of view. To start with, it's probably important to note there are a couple of key things from a global macroeconomic point of view when we start talking economics. So there's economic strategy, which is around using things like your fiscal and monetary tools to control inflation or government spending to influence the level of economic activity in a market. Then there's the, sorry, I wrote this down and then promptly forgot it. I had too many beers last night. Then there's economic statecraft, where they use economic policy to influence other countries' activities. Things like embargoes, trade embargoes, etc., influencing other countries' actions. And then we've got what we're calling at the moment a grand strategy. That's the use of economic policy, political powers and military powers to, again, influence global or other countries in the world in a way that benefits you. And I think, and this is our global economics and markets team putting forward these theories, what Trump's doing at the moment is he's changing that whole perspective, and there's a global strategy here. It's not about tariffs. It's not about increasing the amount of revenue that the US government gets. It's not about influencing a trade with that country. It's about affecting the overall landscape in global economies. It's about cementing that US market as the global hegemony again, the main superpower in the world. And if you start reading beyond the headlines of tariffs here, tariffs there, and you can see it in the way that we actually played out this tariff imposition. The talk of tariffs. I'm going to do a review of all the countries and find out what sort of current trade impediments they've got in place, and then we'll put on reciprocal tariffs. April 2nd came round. Here's my big board of all these tariffs, including Antarctica with penguins or something like that on it. It was a bit of a press grab, but what he's done in this process has completely changed the way people are looking at trade negotiations. I remember when I was at uni, the biggest thing around at that time was the global agreement on tariffs and trade that then became the WTO. There were years of negotiation between countries to try and form trade agreements and move towards a freer trade environment. I don't know how long it took Australia before we pulled out of the recent European trade negotiations for us to get to the point where we decided it wasn't going to be to our benefit anymore. It was taking years. By him throwing that board up there, he has got countries to turn around within 30 days and come back to him with a proposal on how they can change the trade agreements between the two countries and, no doubt, make it better for the US. It's just changing the whole landscape. Also, beyond this, don't forget there's a hidden agenda here. It's not just about the individual country trade with the US, it's about where the US sits in the global market and how that compares to China. It'll be interesting to see what happens when we get to the beginning of July, when the 90-day period comes to an end. How many countries have come back to him and said, this is our new trade agreement, this is how it's going to work. I'm sure they're going to look at it and say, well, is that to the benefit of the US? Yes, that's okay. Is that to the detriment of China? Yes, okay, definitely. If it's still supporting China, there might be a few more conversations to be had in that process. This is about how the US position themselves to maintain that global hegemony position. Just quickly on what the actual tariffs mean from an Australian perspective, where we are at the moment. I did a bit of back of the envelope sort of calculations and tried to get an idea of what it would mean. I'll quickly run through this, but this is talking at an Australian sale yard price for livestock, we were selling lean trim to the US at this stage for $3.12 US a pound. That worked out at $10.72 a kilo at the exchange. It's blended with fat trim that's coming out of their feed yards, which is a lot of at the moment. 75-25%. The fat trim was $1.20, so it works out at $1.68 US a pound in terms of putting together some burger, the perfect burger composition. And again, that's not quite on the screen there, but that's the price of the burger, $6.39 US for a burger. If you add a 10% tariff to that, so you take the $3.12, it becomes $3.43, you run it through that same process, they've got to blend it with the fat trim, it becomes $1.75 a pound. When you add that to a burger, it's about 2 cents. So a 10% tariff potentially means 2 cent increase in price for burger to cover the 10% tariff. Now, who wears that cost? That's the question. It's not a huge cost, but someone's got to wear it. Given the state of the US market, we'll cover that in a minute briefly, I believe that the consumer is wearing most of it, and what we've seen transpire so far, that's playing out. The Australian-New Zealand lean trim price dropped by about 3% between March and April. So assume that part of that 10% is being worn by the Australian exporter, the rest is being picked up at the consumer end of the supply chain. Now, the other thing to be aware of is what happens on the exchange rate side. That was worked out at a 64 cent exchange rate. The dollar dropped to 60 cents not long after April 2 when they made that announcement. If you actually run through those numbers at a 60 cent exchange rate, backwards, it ends up being about 1 cent. So a 3 cent change in the exchange rate almost wipes off half of the impact of a 10% tariff. So you've got to watch the dollar as well in terms of the overall implications of the tariff. But from an Australian point of view, 10%, Brazil got 10%, New Zealand got 10%, all the other big suppliers to the US apart from Canada and Mexico have got their own arrangements. We're all on the same footing. So we haven't lost any of our competitive edge, it's just added a few costs to the system, and I think the consumer is going to be wearing most of those given the situation in the US at the moment. The more important thing from a trade point of view is that what might potentially flow out of all these other trade agreements that are going on in the rest of the world. Because when you start looking at it, the US exports to China. The China-US tariff spat that was going on was leading to China imposing, I think it was 125% tariff on US products going into China. The US was imposing 145% of Chinese products, tariff on Chinese products going back to the US. We supply China, Brazil supplies China. Does China say that's too expensive to buy that US product, which is not a lot, and it was already declining, and US hasn't been given their export accreditation to send to China either. But does it mean China starts looking somewhere else? And we started to hear that in the market, that those Chinese buyers were looking to Australia as an alternative source. So it potentially means we might sell more to China. China might become a little bit more active in the global market. It might push prices up because of an increasing competitive trend. So we just got to keep an eye on what might flow out of all these other trade agreements, not necessarily the direct trade with Australia and the US. I think that's okay. It's what happens in terms of, US China, US Japan, US South Korea. I think Japan had a 25% or a 40%, I can't remember. Korea had a 30 or 40% tariff on that board originally. So whether or not they come to an agreement with the US or whether or not there's any sort of reciprocal arrangements between those countries is just something we've got to keep an eye on. There's also an increased freight charge of Chinese-owned and operated vessels going to the US. It's not as bad as what they had originally said, but it is adding costs to the systems as well. So that's sort of the global economics and a bit of the current geopolitical situation. What's going on in global cattle markets? Global cattle markets, global beef supply, we're expecting to contract by about 2% this year. We haven't seen it in Q1 yet, but we're still expecting through the course of this year, we'll see major markets like Brazil, US, Europe, China, all see a contraction in global beef production this year. The US coming off about 1%, which is 100,000 tonnes. Brazil coming off about 4 or 5%, which is about 500,000 tonnes. All of those big producing countries all seeing a bit of a contraction in production. So that's going to be beneficial from an Australian point of view. When we've got record volumes going into that global market and those other big producers in the world seeing a contraction, that's going to help our situation. Where does it place Australia from a cattle price point of view? Well, all cattle prices are lifting slowly. You can see there's almost sort of a segregation there between North America and Europe and the Southern Hemisphere countries. But all of us are seeing a general sort of lift and appreciation in prices. From a competitive point of view for Australia, we're still very competitive on a cattle price point of view. You've got to add processing costs to that, obviously, to get the actual beef price comparison. On the right-hand side, I've got retail prices there, and as we showed earlier on the food price index, we are seeing retail prices tick up a little bit, but the US continues to pay record prices for beef at the retail level. Australian retail prices for beef edged up 3.4%, I think it was, in Q1 this year, so we're starting to see that retail number tick up again, which from a cattle producer point of view just provides a little bit of space. Now, we're not going to get into the margins and who gets what in the supply chain, but without the pressure from a retailer saying we've got to drop prices and squeezing that back down the line, you know, retail prices being comfortable to potentially go a little bit higher does just provide a little bit more scope in that space. So quickly on to some of the key markets, and we're looking at the US market here on our road trip, of course. I'm running out of time dramatically, so this is going to be very quick. US market, I'm sure we've all heard about it. We've seen a contraction in their US cattle herd there, some of the lowest numbers in over 50 years. The US cow herd slaughter number dropped something like 16% last year. We believe they've reached their bottom of their liquidation cycle. The next thing they're going to move into is a restocking phase. Although we don't think there's going to be any strong restocking activity this year, we just don't have the seasonal conditions in the US to give the producers the confidence to actually go out and buy a lot of cattle and restock numbers. So what we're seeing is with lower cow slaughter in the US, that blue line there is what their lean trim price is at the moment. Because they've got less lean trim, the price for lean trim has gone through the roof and is at record levels. As I said, $3.81 US a pound or thereabouts earlier this year is a new record. We think that's potentially going to continue to edge up into the middle of the year before they reach that part in their season where they start offloading cows as the normal seasonal process does. And we might see that lean trim price ease off a little bit. But still, historically very high prices, and that's not going to correct itself this year or next year. It's going to take them at least 2 years to build up any sort of cow numbers to start bringing that lean trim price back down. The orange line there is what they're paying for the Australian-New Zealand product. You can see it is being dragged up by that US price, but it is not following exactly that US price. Back earlier, you can see through 21 to 23, and that's the general sort of trend we normally see, is that orange and blue line tend to follow each other very closely. That hasn't happened recently, we believe, because it just doesn't have the competitive tension in that global market to push Australian prices up to the same price that the US is paying. As a result, there is a gap there. Now, that possibly means that we could see import prices for Australian product rise a lot more than what they are. So there's scope for upside, but we're just not seeing the competitive tension that's driving it up at the moment. So in terms of my expectations on Australian and New Zealand imported price going into the US, I think there's upside, but it's just not materialising to the same extent that we're seeing in the US. This is just a further example of how that US price has gone up, but yet we haven't seen the prices in Japan or South Korea rise to the same extent. They're getting to a point where they're just saying it's too expensive, our markets are not strong enough to support it, we're going to back out of that market. And without that competitive tension, we're just not realising the full gain in that US market at the moment. This is just quickly where Lance thinks US cattle prices are going to go. It's about a 45% increase from last year to the peak. So the top of the peak up here, if you work on, that's the equivalent of a weaner animal. The orange one's the equivalent of a feeder animal. These are in US dollars, so if someone's quick at maths, you can probably work that out. But we're effectively here in 2025. There's still a bit of a way to go for cattle prices in the US. That's going to make beef in the US continuously more expensive. That's a positive from an Australian point of view. We don't have downward price pressure or increasing volumes of US beef in the market. It's going to mean any US beef going into Japan, South Korea or China is going to become more expensive. It's going to mean that any imports that Australia or any exports Australia can send to the US is going to send into a market where they're paying a lot more for their domestic product than what they are for their imported product. So it's all favourable from an Australian point of view. The US is driving global markets, and it's a good news story for Australia. From a Chinese point of view, you're seeing a few more of these on the road these days. From a Chinese point of view, there are some green shoots in the Chinese market. Imports last year were steady in China. We're expecting imports, Chinese beef imports this year to be about the same, maybe drop a little bit, but not too much. It's a bit hard to see here, but these are retail prices for beef for all the different proteins. The red line there is the retail price for beef, and just in the last 2 months, we've seen that Chinese retail price start to edge back up again. Their domestic beef production, as I said, is expected to contract. They're not expected to import as much, so we're going to start to see those prices lift up again. And that's going to be a positive for the Chinese market if they're exerting a little bit more competitive pressure. This is Haidilao, which is a big restaurant chain, hot pot restaurant chain in China. Again, similar to the Macca's and Burger King sales results that I follow here. You can just see the spend per guest, which is the dark blue line, has just bottomed out. So it had been declining. The amount of spend that every restaurant goer into Haidilao restaurants was spending had been declining for the last, that's 3 or 4 years, isn't it? But it's just started to bottom out. So there are some green shoots. I wouldn't say that China's necessarily improving out of the park, but it's starting to look like we've possibly reached the bottom in that Chinese market and we might see a little bit of upside. So some positive news there for China as well. A little bit closer to home, sorry, I'm over by 5. On the Australian market and where we're tracking at the moment. And I've just put out my seasonal outlook, which was a bit late, but it's out. So if anyone hasn't got a copy of it, feel free. All this information's in there in terms of where I think the Australian market's going to go over the next 12 months. I think we're at our next sort of cyclical peak in cattle numbers. We have got very high slaughter in the market at the moment. We've got very high female percentage in total cattle slaughter at the moment, but I think in terms of cattle numbers on the ground, and granted, there are parts of southern New South Wales and Victoria and southeast South Australia that are dry, and people have had to offload a few more cattle, probably more cattle that aren't finished, lighter cattle, etc., than what they normally would have. But I think from an overall herd inventory point of view, we're at about our next sort of cyclical peak. Now, I'm not saying as a peak we're going to see it drop over the other end, but I'm just saying in terms of any sort of aggressive producer restocking activity, it's going to be pretty benign. We're not going to see people actively out there chasing cattle prices higher. They'll get to the point where they say it's a good deal and then we don't need to go and chase them any higher. So that's going to affect the restocking prices out there, particularly for your female heifers. Obviously, there are a lot more of those going on to feed. Sorry, that was my inventory number. But it is also going to drive increased or continued high levels of slaughter and production into the next couple of years. I'm expecting, or the model's telling me this year, we're going to see about a 2% increase in slaughter numbers. The Q1 numbers that came out just a week or two ago is actually showing that there's a 19% year on year. So I might be under the money on this one. But with those high inventory numbers in the system and the cattle progeny coming through the system, we're going to be doing at least what we did last year in terms of production and possibly higher. Now, I don't think it's necessarily a liquidation of the herd, even though we've got a high female percentage in there. I just think it's the fact that we've got a much more productive and a much more fertile herd producing a lot more cattle. It does mean from a processing point of view, though, that we're starting to push up against our upper limits on what we've done in the past, our historical processing capacity. It does create the risk out there if the seasons go dry and everyone decides to try and sell cattle in a hurry, it's going to become a little bit harder to try and fit them all through that narrow point, being the slaughterhouses or the abattoirs. The other thing too, even though we may not necessarily be matching our high slaughter numbers from back in 2015, so we haven't got to 9 million, we're just over 8 million, but our production volumes are higher than what we were doing back then. The tonnes of beef we are producing is at record levels, even if the total number of cattle being slaughtered isn't. So we've got to find a home for that. You've just got to manage that through the supply chain. That's why looking at things like logistics, anything that's going to slow those boats up, means that someone has to store that meat a little bit longer here, or it's going to be a little bit harder to try and send that somewhere else. That just starts to fill up chiller rooms, etc. It does start to compound on the system. But at the moment, everything seems to be managing. I'm not saying that it's going to go into a situation of free fall, but it's just a risk that sits out there. And if we've got large numbers of cattle, it's an idea, I think, to make sure that you're talking to your off-taker and figuring out, well, how do I fit into the program? How can I make sure that I can continue to get my cattle through the system and not get stuck when everyone else decides to sell cattle and try and send them into the abattoir when there's a 6-week, 8-week wait. In terms of our exports, domestic consumption I don't think is going to pick up too much here from a per capita consumption point of view. Overall population increase I think will mean that domestic consumption stays flat. So we're going to continue to rely on our export markets. The point I wanted to make in this one is that dark blue line there, which is the US. The volume of beef we sent to the US last year made up about 23% of what we actually produced. We consumed 24%. The US ate almost as much Australian beef as the Australian population did. So in terms of influence on our markets, you can understand why we're all watching that US market and the health of that US consumer, because it's having a big impact on the Australian market through the volume of beef it's buying off Australia. Expecting the exports to continue to be strong, obviously high production levels, we need to find somewhere to send it to. And live export numbers similarly. Expecting live export numbers to pick up this year and then into next year. The overall number of live exports is heavily influenced by the Queenslanders and those in the room. Did they all wake up this morning? Whether or not they decide that it's a better option to send cattle into the domestic market, down south into feedlots, etc., or whether to put them on boats has a big influence on the overall numbers in the market. The numbers out of Darwin generally remain pretty steady, and I think with overall herd inventory, the numbers out of the top end will lift a little bit. But it's those Queensland producers deciding which market is the better option for them. My assumptions at the moment is that this year seasonally things are going to be all right. I've put an assumption in there that next year might be a little bit drier, so we might actually see a few more Queensland cattle move into that live export trade, just because the domestic market might have increased cattle numbers and slightly lower interest from the buyers in that market. But that's why we're seeing an increase in numbers. One, increased inventory, but two, increased volume of Queensland cattle coming into that live export market. This was my summary slide. So looking back, but looking forward, and I think Dr. Ross is talking about that. That's the topic of conversation on his presentation later today. But a couple of key messages out of the presentation today. So firstly, I think, from a global economic point of view, we don't have the high costs of a couple of years ago, but there is a degree of uncertainty that exists out there, and a few question marks as to how that might play out in terms of economic growth and consumer activity over the next 12 months. Retail and food service sales are looking okay, but again, a question mark over that consumer confidence and how that might play out over the next 12 months. Whether or not we see central banks starting to tighten up on monetary policy, whether we start to see increased costs in the system because of tariffs and wage rates come under pressure. Does that mean that consumers willing to continue to go out and buy? It might just mean a bit of a channel shift from food service into retail, as we have seen in the past. Global beef production is expected to contract. That's going to continue to support Australia's record production volumes. US beef production is going to continue to contract. That's going to also support Australian record beef production volumes. Obviously, the US being a big supplier into our competing export markets, but also a big importer of Australian product. Asian markets are relatively soft, but there are starting to see some green shoots in that Chinese market. Overall, Australian cattle numbers, I think, at the cyclical peak. Production volume expected to be high, but the solid export markets that we're seeing is going to balance that out at the moment. And I think the Australian cattle market is relatively balanced and okay when we start to look forward. So that will do me. I'm going to be around all day and tonight as well. So if you wanted to talk about any of those or anything else, feel free to tap me on the shoulder at any point. But thank you very much for listening, and hope you have a great conference.